So as I was just so kindly introduced, my name is Hedwig Amelia Waters. I am currently, to explain what the Borderlands project, I'm currently a senior researcher in an EU-financed project at the Department of Asian Studies at Palacký University in the Czech Republic. Sorry, it's a new thing, so I have to remember all of the terms. And so it's called Sinophone Borderlands, and that analyzes how countries that are bordering on China are affected by China. So that's to just talk about that project briefly. So my talk today is on the interrelation of consumer bank debt and the wildlife trade in Eastern Mongolia, where I did my PhD fieldwork. Boka, can you change the... So I'll just talk a little bit about my history and how I came to this topic today that I'll tell you about. So first of all, this project that I'm going to talk to you about today is based on my PhD research. Between 2014 and 2019, I was a doctoral student at University College London in also a different European Union-funded research project called Emerging Subjects of the New Economy. And the point of Emerging Subjects, that project that I was in at the time, was to analyze how the recent boom and bust in Mongolia. So of course you all know that in 2012 there was a mining boom, and then after that there was a mining bust, and how those swings affected everyday people. And so during that period I did 10 months of field work in an area that I've anonymized as Magtaal. For various reasons that I'll talk about, but I think most of you could probably figure it out if you really tried, but I'll explain why I anonymized it at the end of the talk. And so I have a book coming out on this subject if you want to know more about it or want to read deeper into it, and with UCL Press in June 2023. And also I have an upcoming European Union postdoctoral fellowship where I will be studying the medicinal plant trade, and so you'll find out why very shortly. Could you please change the slide? All right, so this area that I've anonymized as Magtaal, here's a little bit of a picture of it. It is a really remote Eastern Mongolian province on the Chinese border, so just to give some ideas about it. And it was important to know is that it was built up as a Soviet agricultural cooperative during the Soviet Union. So that means if any of you are familiar with soum centers, Magtaal soum, as you can see here, has many multi-level apartment blocks, which is kind of unusual for a soum. As you can see in the background. This was all because it was built up as an agricultural cooperative, so centrally organized agricultural cooperative during the Soviet Union. And as said, it's right on the Chinese border. So the soum center is about 30 kilometers from the border. Okay, you can change it. Oh. So I'm going to talk about 3 overlapping trends which kind of create the story that I'm going to paint for you today. So the general ideas, the point of this talk, or the general idea that I'm going to present, is essentially that since the collapse of the Soviet Union in rural areas, there's been a chronic cash dearth. So, I mean, this probably applies to not just rural areas, but in general, rural places, because of low employment and just low access to markets, have had a lack of cash. And so this is like an ongoing thing in the last 30 years. But so when the border to China opened, this presented a situation where there was a lot of people who needed money and had no employment, but then they suddenly needed to find money somehow. So they started extracting from the landscape. It's because it was a good that they could easily sell in China to make money. So no employment, lack of money, and then the border opens and it provides an immediate opportunity for people who don't have money to access money. So I write, let's see, from 1994 onwards, when the border became open to more regular traffic, and then in the early 2000s, this was kind of the situation was somewhat exacerbated or deepened by the implementation or the arrival of consumer bank debt. So people taking out loans when they don't have very much access to cash anyway to get cash. But then, of course, loans have interest pressure, so that creates more pressure on people to then pay back the loans. And so in order to do so in a context of no employment, they go back to the wildlife and pick more. So yeah, that's the general argument. So I'll talk about those three so you can move on. So first I'll talk about chronic cash dearth and how this emerged in the rural regions. So, I mean, it might be, many of you maybe have experienced privatization, but for those who didn't, I'll just talk about general, what happened, general phenomena. So of course, many of you know, in 1991, the privatization law was passed, and so all of these rural cooperatives and state farms were instantly dissolved. And in that course of doing that, in the process of dissolving, these vouchers were passed out to all of the former workers of these former cooperatives as new asset vouchers. So that means specifically in Magtaal, this area I'm talking about, when the Soviet Union collapsed and privatization started and they dissolved the cooperative, all of the former workers received these asset vouchers and they could go to the former state farm and get assets that they could now privatize as their own. So they would turn in vouchers to the former state farm, get animals and machinery, and many of them tried from these assets to collectivize or to create new private companies through this situation. But just the first wave of why this didn't work is, of course, many of you know that in 1992 there was inflation of over 300%. And there was really high inflation in the initial years after privatization. And in addition to that, during the Soviet Union, many of these remote cooperatives, if they created excess product, were allowed to export it to other Soviet countries in order to have consumers. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these new private companies, if they had excess, they had no one to sell it to. And so a lot of them lost money through just crop going bad. So it was a combination of distance from urban centers and consumers, inflation, and the lack of access to consumers that generally after the privatization and between 1991 and 2000, of the 22 private companies that emerged in Magtaal in the privatization scheme, all but one went bankrupt. So you can just see how quickly those assets dissolved. So then in this area specifically, there was a lot of barter because their cash was relatively worthless. So in this soum specifically, the state itself didn't have money, so they paid their employees in flour. So people started using flour as a barter currency. And finally, one thing that's important to talk about is the reliance on social groups that emerged during this period. Obviously, during the Soviet Union, many people talk about how people used social networks to access goods that were rare or difficult to get. But these social networks took on new meanings as like a means of survival in the immediate post-socialist period. So this importance of sociality or social groups is important. So you can go to the next one. It's a lot of words, but one of it's a quote, so I'll read it out. So I talk about in my book, but here I'll just briefly talk about it, network-based economy is the way to describe it. And when I say network-based, many of you are aware of the term suhje maybe. So I'm talking about a suhje-based economy. So essentially, of course, when the border first opened to China, many people started engaging in suitcase trading. So that being So as I said before, the lack of cash, so people needed to find ways to make money. So one way was suitcase trading, where people would go to China, buy wholesale products, and then come back into Mongolia and then resell those at like a piece price, so at increased per piece instead of at the wholesale price. And so that was one phenomenon that emerged in the immediate period. In addition to that, there was, of course, in China, metal was worth a lot, so there was widespread stripping of scrap metal from the Soviet infrastructure. So again, people looking for different ways to create money. So there was widespread stripping. So then I describe this in my book as econo-political networks. So what I mean by this is in a market situation where people, or many people don't have, they themselves can't engage in the market. So in this case, I mean, some people have money, some people have social networks, some people know how to get across the border. So in this situation where any one person isn't able to have enough money to engage in the market by themselves, people often put themselves together in these things that are called soum or networks in order to effectuate some type of economic goal. So this might become more clear what I mean, but essentially, if you live in a rural area and you want to engage in some type of market, but you don't have the money, then you find somebody with money, and then you find somebody with the contacts, and then the three of you together create a business and then share the profits, or move it sequentially. So these kind of network-based economic forms emerged just because most people independently didn't have the ability themselves to engage in the market or didn't have complete access themselves. And so this network-based economic form reoccurs over and over again. So, and I'm just going to give one quote of one guy, one person I interviewed who was a border soldier in 1992, who talks about how these networks really emerged in the post-socialist period as like an economic form. So he says, the process of gathering resources, and when I say resources, he's talking about wildlife. The process of gathering wildlife today is the same as in 1990. Sorry, I'm turning around I know it's awkward. Both were networks, soum, when people would collect iron back then, so the scrap metal that I talked about, they would go in big social groups. For example, there were a lot of military staff, so they organized themselves into a gathering party to collect the stuff together. One person couldn't carry all that iron alone. Before 1990, these groupings didn't exist. So the point being is that because one person was able to create an economic business profitable enough by themselves, they often had to put themselves in these network group formations where each person had a role, and then through working together sequentially, they were able to navigate the distance, for example, between Magtaal in the city or Magtaal in the Chinese market. Okay. Okay, so I was just showing a picture. This is, for example, during the Soviet era, Magtaal had full sanitation and cold and warm water. So this is a warm water boiler. So you can see, of course, this is what the warm water boiler looks like today because of the wave of stripping that happened. So the whole town has a bunch of these old, like kind of the Soviet infrastructure that was completely stripped in the post-socialist era. Yeah. So, okay, so I'll start first now talking a little bit more about the wildlife trade. So obviously, if there's a lack of jobs and cash and there's an open border, so I talked about people looking for different kind of network-based jobs. So one thing was suitcase trading and then salvaging, but of course you can only salvage so much. There is an infinite infrastructure, so eventually people graduated to the environment. So you could say they were starting to salvage from the environment. So in my field site, I'll talk about how this emerged, but so the wildlife trade is often, at least in my field site, it's very much Chinese funded. So I'll talk about how this emerged in this case. So I'm going to talk mostly about a Chinese traditional medicinal plant called feng feng, which is being picked all across Eastern Mongolia right now, illegally. Or when I say right now, I don't know in this moment, but it has been over the last few years, so we can talk about that later. So essentially, in the late 1990s or early 2000s, two Chinese laborers who were working part-time as temp laborers for a Mongolian company in Magtaal noticed that the countryside was just full of resources that were organic and untapped. And so they said, well, we could make a lot of money if we could sell these in China. So they went back to China and got money. And then they came back to Magtaal and they found a local person who was really well known and asked him if he would work as a middleman. So they would give him money and he would go out and distribute money to people or tell people that he would he would pay them back. He would give them money and they can pay him back in this route or these resources. So in my field site, feng feng was very popular, as I'll describe. But in addition to that, Asian carp, so like fish, even though people don't think of Mongolia and fish, but this was also being extracted, and antelope. So, so the situation is fitted again to a situation of cash dearth. If poor people don't have any money, so they can't engage in it themselves, but a middleman arrives and says, I'll give you an advance in cash or in goods like food, and you can pay me back in roots, then if they have no cash, they'll do it, or it's very popular. So this was very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. So these middlemen offered these advances, and that's, I think, an important theme, is that the middlemen have cash flow. And so in this environment of cash dearth, anything that has cash flow is important. So again, it's sulji based, so often like a middleman will know somebody in China, and they'll give them money, and then they'll come to Mongolia, and then they'll spread through word of mouth how to get, like, that they want this resource, and so then they'll tell all their friends, and their friends will tell their friends, and then they'll all go together and collect. So it works through this kind of sulji network-based phenomenon. Okay. So this is just a picture of feng feng, if you were curious. So it's a Chinese traditional medicinal plant that is used in Chinese medicine, but not Mongolian traditional medicine, which is why Chinese people, when they arrived and told them that this was a plant of worth, local people were like, really? Okay, we thought it was a weed. So then, they felt comfortable going and picking it. So it's against wind diseases, if that says anything. And this was very popular during the coronavirus. So actually the Chinese government announced that this was an official anti-coronavirus remedy, increasing again the price of it. So successively, the price of feng feng has just rocketed over the last 20 years. Okay. Oh, okay, so it's just a picture. They're just picking mush, so bird berries, nothing that crazy. But I have this picture just to show like the general formations. People will pool money and get their friends and group of family members together and then go out into the countryside and go on these picking tours for days at a time. So then, they bring their food with them and then pool the money. Okay. And this is just me in China, in Inner Mongolia. So he didn't want to get pictured by himself, so I'm in the picture. But this is an Inner Mongolian man who's selling fish that was illegally smuggled across the border from China. Okay. So some dynamics here that I want to talk about. One important thing is, since then there have been some formal companies that have emerged in Magtaal, so some formal companies that have arrived. So specifically mining companies, resource extraction companies, agricultural companies that are based in UB and go out there and have set up new industry. The problem, though, is that there's a huge mismatch between the expectations of these companies and local people in terms of employment. So companies tend to circumvent local people, so they don't hire them. So there's very low rates of hiring locals for these kind of UB-based companies. Let's see. Right, so these companies now, there are companies locally, but they function essentially as like islands, like enclaves. So they don't really, even if you're driving there, it like seems like an enclave in the steppe. There's this company and they have no connection at all to the rest of the soum. So that's why it is important to talk about that now, since then there are companies, but they still don't employ local people, so it acts as a type of parallel economy. So then, of course, then also feng feng, for example, and other resources have been illegalized since then. In 1995, a bunch of laws got passed to create a fine and permit system. So for example, if you're caught with 1 kilo of feng feng, you have to pay 250,000 MNT. But I'll tell you, I say there's a but, though, to that, so I'll get to that in a second. And so I also have increase in informal wildlife prices. So of course, then feng feng, as I mentioned, has just continually increased in price over the last 20 years, also undergirding why it's such a popular thing despite its illegality. Okay. So for those who are interested, I'm sure I figured I'd get this question, how these products are moved internationally. So it's through networks of middlemen, so middlemen who know people, and so at each node, it's kind of the price is increased. So you can see here, for example, that in Magtaal, when you pick a 1 kilo of feng feng, it's only worth 5,500, but at every node, as it changes hands, by the time it reaches South Korea, for example, it's 300,000 per kilo. And so this is an example. This was in 2017, but now you can see that in 2017 in UB it was 45,000 per kilo, but now it's 150,000. So you can see also how coronavirus has affected these prices. So it's just very popular and very expensive in China, which is also why people continue engaging in the trade. And so there's two forms of export. People will locally either hide it in their motorcycle and go across. So I know that's a little difficult now with the border being closed, but that was the case in 2017. Or they'll sell it to middlemen who will bring it to UB and pack it in building material or tires or coal trucks. So a lot of feng feng is found in the middle of coal, just to give an example. So, I think Buka's gone. Well, if you have any questions so far. It's okay. Okay, so obviously people are going to ask me why this continues if it's illegal. And I have here in quotations moral economy, but I'll describe what that is in a second. But essentially, at the time that I did field work in 2017, arguably between 50 to 80% of the soum was picking this root. So essentially, one informant of mine said everyone from the ages of 6 to grandmothers in their 60s is picking. And I say picking because in Mongolian the word is tuch that they kept using, but I mean harvesting when I'm saying picking. So point is that pretty much every family had people engaging in this trade or harvesting in some capacity. So as a result, there was a real reluctance by the local government to actually crack down on it because you're essentially doing something that's very unpopular. So there was, for example, even nature protectors that I knew who were supposed to find feng feng pickers were themselves picking because they themselves didn't feel like they made enough, so that on the weekend they'd go picking to make supplement income. So, and because if nature protectors themselves are picking and their families are picking, then they don't want to criminalize their own families, like they don't want to arrest their dad. So that was basically because it was so widespread, people didn't want to really crack down on it locally. So all of the incidences I know of arresting regarding feng feng when I was doing field work happened when people not from the soum, so like a military post or something, came across somebody came across somebody picking. So like once, for example, some people wanted to get some really beautiful fresh root which was growing in the border zone between China and Mongolia. So they got arrested because they were by the border police because they were in the border zone, which was, an international problem. But that was the only incidents I know of real criminalization of feng feng picking during my field work. So I write moral economy. This term is a term for kind of like a solidarity-based economy. But what I mean is because everyone was picking and they were all dependent on it, they also all thought that it was in their interest to help each other not get arrested. So there were phone trees and like techniques of distraction. So for example, if they saw a ranger go out to the east, then local people would call people who are picking in the east and warn them. So stuff like that. Or they would give them false tips and stuff like that. So when I was doing field work, there was a really strong narrative locally that the government wasn't providing for them, not giving them jobs. So this is the thing that's giving them jobs, so we're going to help each other pick. All right, so now I'll go into part 3, which is about the consumer debt and how this kind of exacerbated this situation. So, okay, so as I've described, there's like a real chronic lack of cash in the area. So when consumer loans first arrived through the Han Bank or the Turin Bank in the late 2000s or early 2010s, there was a real enthusiastic uptake of loans. So people telling me, oh, this is the gift of the market, we're now part of the new economy, private property is the gift that the economy is giving us. So many of them were just really enthusiastically receiving these loans. And as I described, showed at the beginning, one thing that's a little different about Magtaal than some other regions is that there were those those apartment blocks. So that means essentially when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of the former workers that lived in those apartment blocks automatically got the flat deed, so they automatically became owners of those apartment blocks. And so when that happened, essentially they had an automatic form of collateral. And so when these loans arrived, the entire town collateralized their apartments to get money. In addition, because it's a border region, there were a lot of military postings and also a hospital, so there are a lot of people with a regular salary, and they could use those also as a form of collateral, so a salary loan. So, and then there's all these small business development loan schemes that emerged in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so there was a proliferation of small businesses in Magtaal, and so it's only a town of 3,000 people or less, right? But there were multiple stores, vegetable cooperatives, multiple bakeries, multiple cake stores, all sorts of things. And then in addition to that, of course, many of you Mongolians might also be aware of all the different type of loan options. So also in the countryside that emerged at that time that you could get mortgage loan, herder loans, licensing where you have just from consumption items, children loans, consumption loans, there's tons of loans. So at the beginning of the 2010s, there were a lot of loan options suddenly in this town. Okay. So my own opinion by the time I reached there in 2015 is that there were just too many loans for any of these individual companies or these individual stores to be really that profitable, because there's a low population. So there's only so many bakeries that one town needs. And in addition to that, there's high distance from other consumers and from urban centers. And so what I saw is that many of these like small bakeries and what have you were only profitable during the summer when tourists would arrive, and then for the other 3 months of the year they weren't profitable. And in addition to that, these border regions are really highly susceptible to the exchange rate with China. So of course, when there's an economic lull, but people are getting most of their consumption items from China, everything suddenly gets more expensive. So for all of those various reasons, there was just all these places, and all of the store owners I talked to had just really, really minimal profit margins. And so when in that kind of atmosphere, so loans were not used so much in the way they're intended, which is to create a profitable business over the long term, but more so as like a temporal fix. So what I mean is that if they're profitable in the summer, but not in the rest of the year, then they'll get a loan in the fall, and then they will pay that loan back the next summer when they get income again. So there's a lot of these kind of people didn't have money all the time, so they could only pay back at certain points. So loans were often used to like navigate the in-between. And so I write the term davkhartzeil because that was used a lot during my fieldwork, that people would get loans, so even that people would get loans to pay back other loans, or that people often had multiple loans running at the same time. Like for example, with a salary loan, you can get the loan and then you can pay back a few months, and then you can get another cash influx and then kind of push the loan repayment date into perpetuity. So people did that a lot. Like they'd have a mortgage loan. If they couldn't pay that back right now, they'd get their salary loan, pay the mortgage loan, then they'd pay back the salary loan a few months, then and then they would get another bunch of money from that and pay the mortgage loan, so this kind of stuff. So just in the sense that all people didn't have enough cash ongoingly, so they used these as kind of navigating schemes more so than like creating a long-term profitable business. Yep. Okay, so at that point then, for a town of 3,000 people, then in the 2010s, moneylenders arose as a new type of business, which was, for a town of 3,000 people or less, there's 7 moneylenders that were working there when I was there. And, these are just some examples of like what I photographed, the kind of, these are the flat deeds to the flats I was talking about, so people use those as collateral. Then there's like children money and their, social security. And this is kind of just giving a picture of like kind of how complex these networks were. People often, one of the money lenders I interviewed a lot, lived literally in the apartment above the bank, so because it was practical, because people would come to the bank, realize they needed to pay off a loan, go upstairs, collateralize something to get money from her, go downstairs and pay off the bank. So just to give an example, this was like an ongoing thing. So when I saw like Mongol Bank like reports from 2017, and they said that people had, like Mongolia had a debt to GDP ratio of 25%, I was like, I don't know how these numbers are made, because when in my field site, everybody, and I know this is like a little bit, because there's specifics based on it being a border region and also having the Soviet cooperative, former cooperative being there, but everyone had 1 or 2 formal loans, then they paid them back with each other. Then they had a moneylender loan, and then several kinship loans that themselves were money that those people got from the bank. And so this was like this insane network conglomeration going on of money moving back and forth. All right. Let's see. Okay, so what this did though, in this kind of context of lack of money, so we've talked a lot now, I mean, in contemporary society, we're also often talking a lot about inflation, where there's too much money chasing too few goods. But what happened in Magtaal was more deflation of local goods. So what I mean is that if money is at a premium and everybody needs money, then people are going to offer up more and more things that they can provide to get money. And so this kind of happened through multiple things that I'll give examples of. Before I go into that, I should make the very important point that, of course, if there's already cash dearth, and then there's low profit margins, people take out loans, and those loans have interest, then that doesn't help the cash dearth. So it just creates more pressure. And so in this case, so for example, in Magtaal, people often didn't have enough money to even get food from the store. So often stores would give out things on loan. So you could go to the store and get a bread and then pay back later when your income came in. But so in my field site, so to talk about how the devaluation happened, in my field site there was like essentially like a bread cartel. Like all the local stores set bread prices at a price that was favorable to them, but because local people didn't have money, so they couldn't go and like buy bread at a cheaper rate somewhere else, they had to go to those stores because they were ones offering loans. And so when they would pay back, either in money, but often when they would pay back in other things like meat or arush, dried curd, or tarak, and other things, then the store owner could set the price in their interest, so basically getting more over time for their bread. So another example of this kind of thing happening through cash dearth is, so many of you probably aware of like meat middlemen, so meat change in the countryside, so when you slaughter an animal, for example, you have to be able to sell all of the meat at the animal at once, but local people often didn't have enough money to buy an entire animal at once. So herders didn't have any option but to sell. And the other part of this is that the meat middlemen, the meat change, so there were these companies that I talked about locally, these agricultural companies, but individual herders didn't have enough means to supply these companies, which had such a high rate of demand for meat. So essentially, herders only could sell their meat to change at a price that was really favorable to those middlemen. Sorry, I'm going between the word change and middlemen. But they could only sell it to these middlemen because that was their only option, because local people didn't have enough money to buy. They were too far from urban centers, and when they would bring their animals to urban centers, they'd lose money in the course of bringing it that distance. And they also didn't have enough accessibility or enough animals themselves to supply a company. So you can see through these different things, through this like cash dearth, it creates these situations where power players or those people with the money can set prices in their favor, and then other things that people locally provide kind of get devalued socially, gradually, because it is money that's at the premium rather than the goods. And in this context, though, to go back to wildlife was the only product locally that didn't get devalued. So it has like a constant cash flow, its prices are competitive with other regions, but also in Magtaal, there was just so many resources locally that it was more so that the middlemen were competing to get good pickers or harvesters rather than the other way around. So, and because of that, wildlife didn't devalue while pastoral products did. So the point being, in this condition of cash dearth and local products are not really, don't have as much weight anymore to be able to pay back the money, the only thing that local people could really rely on to be able to get money reliably was wildlife trade. So, and then a final important point in this is that this wildlife money that was coming in from China did not have interest stipulations on it, whereas any type of money that came from the Mongolian urban centers always had an interest stipulation. So I'll talk about this in a second. Oh, we're missing a person over there again. Oh, he is? Oh, sorry. I'll come back to that point in a second. I was just going to give a story of a person I met while doing fieldwork who was a very well-known picker, wild feng feng harvester. Her name, I've given her the name Amina, but to give an example of how these kind of loans are used to navigate these flexes in income. So Amina was a cleaner in the school in Magtaal, which means her salary was $373,000 per month, and then she also had to pay her Social Security, so she made $300,000 every month. And then she received a salary loan because she has a formal employment contract, so she can get a salary loan, and that she used that to pay for her daughter's school tuition and to go to university. And so then her income per month was knocked down to 50,000 tukruk. So in this kind of context, these kind of loans, the loans are used to navigate this influx. So she now has 50,000 per month. So she went to receive a moneylender loan at the start of the year, the school year. So in the fall, for her son's clothing for the new year, and then to pay that back, she got a loan from a feng feng middleman. So and the middleman knew though that she was a really good picker, so he wanted to give her money because, like I said at the beginning of when I was talking about the emergence of the feng feng trade, it works really well in contexts of cash dearth because they always have cash. So she got an advance. So I should call it an advance rather than a loan in this case because there's no interest stipulation on it. So the point being is that in April then she got money from the feng feng middleman, and then she paid that back over the end of summer and the beginning of fall by picking in feng feng and then giving that back to the man. So this is, you can see though, in the course of this, Amina has a bank loan that's paid through a moneylender loan that's paid through the feng feng loan, or advance, and it's at the end of the day it's only feng feng that is increased where she actually is making money. I mean, sorry, it's a little overly put, but you get my point.
So what is feng feng? Is it like official company like
Oh, no, so you missed that at the beginning. But fengfeng is a Chinese traditional medicinal plant that is being picked wildly across Eastern Mongolia, also Siberia and Inner Mongolia at the moment. So I'm talking about fengfeng as a plant that people are picking in order, and that's being exported through these Chinese-funded middlemen into China. So fengfeng is the Chinese term for it. In Mongolian, it's called dirvgir jigaru, but oh, you know it, huh? Yeah. Okay, sorry, let's go to the next one. I'm approaching the end, and then you can ask me questions like this. So just giving an example of the flows, informal flows. So if you scale out to like the township level then, there are really three main flows happening. One is what I put in red is the money that's coming from urban Mongolia, which is all money that has an interest stipulation on it. So like bank loans or moneylender loans. And then you have the money coming from China, which I put in blue because it has no interest stipulation. And then the green is the resources. So essentially at the level of the township, people make money through exporting their resources, or first usually getting a bank loan, then they can't pay it back, so then they pick more resources and get money from the Chinese moneylenders that don't have an interest stipulation and use that money to pay off the bank loans. So you could say at least in the soum, the bank loans are being paid back through this wildlife trade money. I don't know about the rest, but just that soum specifically. Yeah, you can change it. Okay, so my final thoughts here. Sorry, lots of writing. It's a remote area, so it's just an economy that's very vulnerable. Even since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's just been constant cash dearth. There's this dependence on China for consumption items, but there's also large distance from Mongolian consumers, so there's never really any opportunity to make large amounts of profit. So in this kind of sphere of chronic cash dearth, loans with their interest kind of exacerbated that, in addition to leading to increased inequality or separation in terms of those people that have money or access to money are able to use or be price setters in the market. And there's also, because of that, devaluing of things that are readily available locally, like meat and milk and other types of pastoral products. And importantly, again, in this sphere, the only money that's entering the soum that doesn't have an interest payment on it is the wildlife trade, which is why it's so readily engaged in locally. And even though it's illegal, people readily help each other do it. So in my opinion, the reason why I anonymized the place is because I didn't want, when I talked about this, the message to be that let's criminalize poor people more, because many people locally don't love that they're doing it. They often were talk to me about how they'd prefer to have another form of employment if they could, because many people do not feel totally comfortable with extracting illegally from the environment that they love. So I've been told that the problem is lack of education, but in my experience, people know that they shouldn't do it, and also don't really want to. But it's more so a matter of survival in the contemporary market, and also helping each other socially survive. And in doing so, it also feels somewhat moral or ethical. Because they're helping each other survive in this context of kind of general feelings of neglect by the government, or isolation, or not being provided for. So really the solution to me would be just to create more channels of cash flow into the rural regions. So whether that's through more employment that's regulated, or encouraged that companies actually employ local people in large amounts, or grants, I don't know. It's just different ways. I know that's not popular, but different ways to get cash flow into the area. So many of these other monopolization or inequality events don't have as much ability to emerge. Yeah, so one last slide. Just me riding off into the sunset. So thank you for listening. Yeah, okay.
I don't know if you included in your study what is the ecological role of this plant?
Yeah, so that is like kind of, I mean, I can't answer your questions, but that is very much what I want to move into in the next research project I'm doing. But to answer the first question, there is, okay, so first, actually I'll answer the second question first. It is ecologically, it's important to prevent desertification. So through uprooting feng feng, that does increase desertification. So of course it's not good for the environment generally. People locally created different kind of moral narratives of how they could like try and only pick in different rotations or try and cut only parts of it every year, but I don't think that's actually in praxis very, it doesn't prevent the desertification. But it is the case that, this is what I said, that people don't really, they know that it's not so great that they're doing it because informants would talk to me about how in the early 2000s they would just walk to right outside of the soum and could start picking it, but now they have to drive around 100 kilometers to the south. So the area is very big, so they do have to drive quite a bit now. And that's why I said with the border crossing, the border area is of course an unpicked resource, so people were feeling enough pressure or desire to go into some like semi-dangerous areas. But so the point being is that it is decreasing, but it hasn't decreased so much that it's created competitive feelings amongst people yet. And in addition to that, and this might be another question that pops up, is I know the border is closed right now, which in a way gives this plant kind of respite. So I fully anticipate that once the border opens again and some of this plant resources have grown back, that will reemerge.
What part of this plant is collected?
The root? Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So what about the population in this zone? Because you've been there quite a while, and so now there are 3,000 people. So if the population is changing over time, or is it stable, quite stable? And if you look at the demographic, is it mostly elders or younger generation are still there? And then what about the urban population? Because
Right.
and then what the livestock production will contribute for the household economy. For instance, cashmere or meat.
Sorry, could you repeat that same question, last question again?
The last question is what the proportion of the income comes from the livestock production. I'm assuming that most of the families are herders, herding families, since it's a rural area.
Okay, so let me, I'll answer those different questions and then you can tell me if I got all of it. But so the soum in general is around 3,000 people. The soum center is around 1,500 people, so 1,500 in the region around it. Compared to other soums, herding, there are many herders, but compared to other soums, it's not a huge portion of their income because of the distance from their urban center. So it's really hard for them to make money off of herding. And so this is what I said about the phenomenon with the meat middlemen, is that because local herders don't have enough herds to be able to supply companies, they can't engage in that. So herding is not a very profitable industry locally. People basically mostly herd for self-consumption. So, and that's one of the reasons why, like feng feng in this kind of incident is, or in this kind of dynamic, is very readily engaged in that and other types of extraction. Yeah.
Looks like you studied very, very well about loan stacking.
Right.
Yeah, which is happening in Ulaanbaatar too. Like,
of course.
We have like smartphone loans, demand, Mompay.
Like payday loans kind of thing? Or no, like fintech. Oh, okay.
Yeah, fintech.
Yeah.
And did you like? So I'm asking question about herder loan. Do you think the herders they got loan from bank,
Mm-hmm.
So do you think they invest well in their like in your observation? Do you think they well invest in their like herding business, or like do they buy truck, to move away, or do they just buy like nice smart TV, or like why herd loan, like what to buy.
Okay. I definitely encountered people with herder loans. Herders that I interviewed got loans a lot for tsaransar, so in order to give gifts to their family members, and also send their kids to school. So it was overwhelmingly, I mean, of course, I know it's like the expectation, of course some people get consumption goods, I mean, and that exists as well, but easily, like, creating social networks and maintaining them in this sphere is so important, especially if you all have no money. You really need good contacts, and so half of the money you get goes to creating or like strengthening contacts. So really the herders I knew mostly had tsaransar loans and children stuff.
Did you ask how much?
How much did a herder loan consist of?
For tsaransar spending.
Tsaransar
spending.
Yeah.
Like, how much do they buy gifts from really hobby?
I mean, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I mean, I did interview people who gave me those kind of numbers, but you do spend like 600,000. And then if you have a herder loan that's 1 million tukruk, then like that's not that much left over. Yeah.
The criminalization of these marijuana or medicinal herbs is that people there, locals, are selling it to the Chinese. In your opinion, is to decriminalize these things. Is that correct?
Wait, it's my opinion that I want to decriminalize them?
Yes.
I didn't say that.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just said that I didn't want the point of this talk to be that somebody hears it and they send more policemen out to criminalize poor people. Like the point is to create more flows of money to rural areas. So there's already criminalization. So that's not like, it already exists. So, yeah.
So this is a sensitive topic, and people are obviously like probably a bit wary of accepting outsiders and researchers in to come and study this stuff. So I was wondering, what kind of challenges did you have with gaining public trust to conduct this research, and then how did you overcome those challenges?
Well, yes, I got accused of being a spy a few times. I also got arrested for a day in the border point. So there are things that happen.
On the Chinese side? Or?
No, in Mongolia, but so I was there for a long time, and I spoke Mongolian pretty well. And so the combination of that was that even if people accused me of being a spy, I could respond to it. And it partly, maybe the Mongolians can like attest to this, but there's like, rumor is used a lot as like a controlling mechanism, but it's not always so serious. Like, so people would call me a spy, but then it didn't really have it was like, oh yeah, our local spy, like, and so after, yeah, I don't know, stuff like that. So after a while, like people just got used to me. But another tactic I definitely used was that if I wanted to have a really good interview with somebody, first of all, because networks count for a lot, I always found like somebody who was well known to call the person. If this is something you want to do yourself, you find somebody locally who's like of good repute, and then they will find you people to talk to, and then you should talk to them when they're alone. Like,
you use the same social networks to engage.
Right, you use social networks because then the person goes, well, Oyun Chimik vouched for her, so yeah, it's okay. And then if the neighbor knocks, then she'll just like talk about something else during the interview. So I'm talking actually about Amina. Like, I noticed she gave me such great information, but it was always when we were alone. And then I had great conversations when I wasn't alone in a car with somebody, because they felt safe that way. So stuff like that. Use social networks and try and navigate a situation where you're alone socially with the person. Yeah.
Thank you.
How far is what?
Is Magtaal soum from your place, or just
Over 1,000 kilometers, but I don't want us to be too suspicious.
Sorry, I'm asking that. One thing I'm wondering, so when you were living there and kind of engaging and creating some friendship with people in
Yeah.
this local, so what do you think, how your research will help them in the future?
How my research will help them?
Yeah. Do you have kind of, what will be the practical implication from your study to help the locals just to get away from this, the difficulties?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to do a new project on medicinal plant business to create more sustainable options for medicinal plant businesses, yeah. But in the course of this, I mean, I can give recommendations that the people should send more money to the countryside, but will that happen? It's not really something that politically is very popular at the moment, So it's not so much, I can give recommendations, but it's not so much of that. I don't know if politically that can be implemented.
One thing I'm just wondering, because in every soum or every countryside will have this, the people from that soum, originally, and they're living in UBD, usually treated like kinship, community cause,
Yeah,
college or something. I don't know how to say in English.
yeah.
So
Homeland Association, it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Association. So usually these people also have some ideas how to help to build,
Mhm.
So maybe, I don't know if you have time just talk to these people, if they have this.
Definitely, I've interviewed
association.
the heads of the Notikins often because they've come locally, but it is the same problem that I presented, is that the issue is cash dearth. So, a Notikins person what can they do with that? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm open if you have suggestions of the kind of,
No,
yeah.
just there's nothing so good came into my mind. Maybe these people, because they are from this place originally, they might have some ideas or suggestions,
Sure.
to help the people.
Sure. I think most of these issues are all around the border region, though. So this isn't just specifically Magtaal. This is every region that's far from UB that doesn't really have a reliable form of industry or hasn't since the Soviet Union, and is reliant on Chinese market for consumption versus the Chinese market for employment or money. So I don't think this is specifically just Magtaal. This is, if Fengfeng is being picked here, but every region in the border has a different resource. So they all are engaging in different resource extractions. Yeah. Sorry.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this Fengfeng, can you cultivate it? You sort of mentioned that medicinal business, so medicinal herb business, so perhaps if you can cultivate it, you don't have to employ people and give
Right.
out cash and export it like a formal business out there.
Yeah. Definitely. So that is kind of what I want to look at in my next project, is how that's possible. But of course, the thing about the medicinal plant business and the central dynamic or kind of tension in the medicinal plant business is that the more the medicinal plant is deemed organic/wild, the more it's worth. So, and especially with some plants like mushrooms, you can actually see that in the makeup of the mushroom, if it's wild or not. And so that's the central tension of these things, is the reason why this is so lucrative is because it's wild growing. But of course, that just is not sustainable. Like, you just can't do that. So over the long term. So it will have to translate at some point into like a cultivation business, yeah. I would think, yeah.
The other question I had was, this soum was founded as an agrarian collective.
Yeah.
So, what sort of vegetables or cultivated plants did it grow, and is it possible to bring that back potentially?
I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, the agrarian cooperative I'm talking about here provided so much wheat that it like fed half of Mongolia. So it's like incredibly like rich. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about the dissolution of the assets right after the Soviet Union collapsed, because people tried, but of course now the economics are now different. It's no longer this like massive inflation period anymore. So, sorry, just the problem being though, it's still far and there's still few Mongolians. So you have to create a way where you can export it. Yeah. But it's possible. That's not something that's impossible, yeah.
Have you ever happened to experience like hunting?
I didn't want to do that because I'm super obviously like the foreigner in the region, so I didn't want to engage in stuff that was illegal. So I went on like semi-legal trips, but not illegal ones. Well, not completely. I don't know. I did some stuff, but I did not see tsarantsir. Also, that's considered like a male thing. Like when you it's really hard as like a woman to get people to take you on hunting expeditions. Yeah. Does hunting cultivate wind horses, Hemud?
Yeah.
Does it? Oh, okay, yeah, but
Perhaps.
just like I can't kill an animal, I can't go hunting. Yeah.
And in that same vein, you had mentioned the antelope trade earlier on, but throughout the presentation it seemed like a large focus was on the fang fang.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any like further research on the export of the antelope trade, or like any additional insights that you gained?
Oh, no, I didn't, sorry, I didn't focus on that so much because it was just like kind of that antelope trade was also much more closed, as in like how many people were doing it, than the feng feng. The feng feng was like everybody was doing it, so I could go out with grandmas and there wasn't so much of like a feeling of like, even though it was illegal, it was kind of like, it was like an open secret that it was happening. But with the antelope, that's much more like, also when people go on those hunting expeditions, the men will literally lie down and go to sleep and wake up and keep going. Like there's, like physically, it's incredibly difficult. So no, I didn't go on those. So I was just told that it was like a similar dynamic of like a Chinese person giving them money and then they paid back through antelope or wolves or different things of that sort. Yeah, sorry, I don't have more for you.
One more question.
Sure.
What do you feel when you see like this drastic difference of rural people and the urban people? What do you think?
What do I see? Because I lived in the, oh, no, go ahead. What was the end of your question?
Yeah. When I go to zones like this, like, you know, I'm shocked. Like when I stay there, like I'll be like surprising and like 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
And like this contrast, you know, this contrast is way too much. The life in Ulaanbaatar and life in Soum, life in Kuto,
Mm-hmm.
life of herder, so different. And like their opportunities are so different.
Yeah, I mean, I have like a very nuanced look at this because, of course, I have spent a lot of time in both urban and rural Mongolia. I find there are definitely huge discrepancies, so much so sometimes I think urban people, maybe like the way you said, are not even aware of it, that there are really different cultural worlds. And one thing that annoys me a lot is when rural people are like talked negatively about, like an orc or something of that sort, because I think there's also a lot of value in rural culture. Like there's like these networks of people helping each other, and also different cosmological ways of engaging with the land and seeing it as like a network and stuff like that, which of course is being challenged through this kind of stuff where people are suffering economically, and they have to adapt. So my book is really about like how people adapt morally to engage in stuff that they historically wouldn't have done. But there's a lot about sharing and care towards the environment and care towards each other that happens in the countryside that I think when I encounter people who just want to develop or like people who just just think that development is the goal. Like I don't completely agree with that, just because I think there's so much value in rural culture that isn't being considered. And so it creates this huge discrepancy between the rural and the urban. There's such beauty in it, and I think it's not being recognized. Yeah.